Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Savita, we can hear you.
Super.
Maybe you're not visible.
Yes. Sorry. So I'm not going to switch on the video because what you call I've joined through the phone, right. So I feel that the bandwidth might not be sufficient, especially because
perfectly fine.
So I'm not switching on the video for that case. Can we have the PPT on? So, sorry about this. Something that I've just realized. Every time I do conference, there's always a tech that comes in. So some bandwidth is not allowing me to join in. So I'm using my phone. So maybe 3 times that there's a break, but I hope it holds good for the next 30 minutes. So, Anama, can we have the first slide, please?
Right. Prashant, just move to the second slide.
Yeah, so maybe if you could just go, Prashant, to the slideshow and do start presentation. Because then the whole PPT will be visible.
Right. Just start the slides to show and make it a full screen.
Yeah, you'll have to, I think, hit that enable editing button and then go to slideshow and do start presentation.
Be on the second slide, Prashant. Be on the second slide.
Okay. So that we don't waste time, I will meanwhile just start giving a little bit of background on what NFT essentially means while Prashant starts up the slideshow. Prashant, like I said, just click on the enable editing. Could you do that first, please? So once you click on enable editing, which is right on top, the protected view, then you'll be able to go to the slideshow. Now, can you see the yellow little line just below the orange?
Savita, just give us like 2 minutes, okay?
Sure, no worries.
Hello, yes, ma'am.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of background while this is being unraveled. So my talk today essentially is about non-fungible tokens and the intellectual property protection as far as NFT or non-fungible tokens are concerned. So if you essentially, I think you've spent the whole day understanding the IP rights with respect to different technologies. And interestingly, you've done blockchain, you have done artificial intelligence. Apart from that, you have understood what is patents, copyrights, trademarks, which were the other sessions that were there for today. So with respect to the non-fungible tokens, what is interesting with respect to it is somehow it stems from all the other descriptions that you have studied through the day. And what we are going to try to do is understand the two concepts that are there, NFT, as well as what is its link or what is its relationship as far as intellectual property rights are concerned. Prashant, next slide, please. Yeah. So if we look at what NFT is all about, what we can essentially understand is that it's a cryptographic tool which taken or which is essentially existing within the blockchain system. And when these two concepts essentially come together, you get something very unique, which is a digital asset. That digital asset is essentially what is known as a non-fungible token. Now, when you look at that non-fungible token, and I'm going to now use the acronym for it, which is NFT from now on, it will represent these assets that are being created. So what is essentially happening is that whether it is an artwork, whether it is a tweet, whether it is some kind of an object, all that essentially is getting minted and you get a token format of it, which is what that NFT is all about. Now, what happens is that since this is taking place on what is known as a blockchain, the ownership of that essentially is created in a ledger format, again, technology that you're utilizing. The main thing that you have to remember is that NFT is powered by different contracts. One of the most prominent ones is called Ethereum's, and they have basic standards, which is known as a smart contract. And that smart contract that has been provided essentially creates the correlation between the blockchain, the owner, as well as the NFT that has been surrounding. Now, what is the main thing or main issues with regard to NFTs? One, there is a lack of regulation. Two, the laws that are in existing are extremely archaic and is not recognized the new formats that have now come in, especially with blockchain and crypto. It is also now a very, very important topic of interest as far as intellectual property is concerned, because one needs to understand what is the intellectual property that gains when we are looking at NFTs. All this essentially creates your non-fungible tokens that are there. The other thing that you have to now, next slide, please. The other thing that one has to essentially also understand is that with regard to NFTs, if you look at it just purely on what it is about, like I've said, it's basically cryptographic tokens that are existing on a blockchain, and it cannot be replicated, and therefore you're creating yourself what is digital asset. But what is a very interesting aspect all by itself is that it is not the token that is essentially the asset. It is a representation of that asset, which is on the blockchain. When you get a certificate that is attached, that is when you get your ownership as far as that token is concerned. So when you look at this whole ability to exchange or to substitute these tokens, you see two formats that essentially come into being. These two formats are basically called fungible and non-fungible, and we will essentially talk about or know what is the difference between this. But before we go, we have just spoken about different concepts. We're talking cryptography, we've talked about blockchain, we've talked about token. But what are these concepts? I just want to take a minute for you to essentially understand that also. Because though through the day you have essentially looked at it, it is very important for us to see what these concepts are in order to understand how an NFT functions. Prashant, the next slide, please. So this, like I said, the key terms are essentially put here. We're looking at digital asset. We're looking at it existing in blockchain. We are seeing that you're going to get tokens, but that token is not what your asset is. The ownership lies in the certificate that is on that blockchain. And it is basically streamed together or strung together with a smart contract. And the whole idea of exchange essentially comes in. And then the category of fungible, non-fungible. Could you go to the next slide, please, Prashant? So looking at the basic concepts that we have in place, let me just quickly run through what cryptography is. So when you talk about that it is a cryptographic token, what do you mean by cryptography? Cryptography is basically the study of secure communication techniques that allow only the sender and the intended recipient to view its content. So you basically are taking a communication technique, and in India, this is recognizable under the telecommunications law. There is a notification to the effect. There is no specific law as far as this is concerned. So what you will see is that any derivation that we have as far as these different concepts are concerned, though not existing in its terminology in the new law, we are able to derive it from our extant laws that are existing. So cryptography, it's a communication technique. It is only between the two people, which is the sender and the recipient. It's derived from the Greek word kryptos. And what it basically does, it's kind of like encryption that has been in existence. So, you look at your WhatsApp message, it says encrypted. Why? Because it's only for the sender and the receiver that is there. So this basically uses what is known as ciphertext, and that ciphertext goes back. It is the machine that essentially then creates the readable format. Then what happens is that there are clouds of information and images that are created. You have techniques called microdots or merging, which basically translates all this, and electronic data gets transmitted. It reaches the two sides. This cryptographic method essentially is now utilized on a new technology, and one of the most prevalent technologies called blockchain. Prashant, could you go to the next slide, please? So if you look at the whole blockchain methodology that exists, what we have is that blockchain is nothing but a list of records that is out there in your cyberspace. It is linked together with this technology called cryptography. So you have these two basically existing. So what happens is whatever data you're transmitting, it essentially gets a particular hash tag that is provided there. That tag and a timestamp creates a particular block. This block essentially is published, and that block essentially contains the information about what has been created in it. And you keep adding the blocks. Now, this is as late as I can get as far as this is concerned. So when you add all these blocks together, changing even a singular block, meaning changing that entire system that is there. So that is why blockchains are resistant to modification, because it can only be altered retroactively without altering all subsequent blocks. You have to go back to scratch, change if you change anything, and then you move on to create blocks that are there. This is typically managed by a peer-to-peer network, and it is used as a publicly distributed ledger where you have the protocols that are there that validate these blocks that are created. What is interesting about blockchain is its security. It is secure by design. Only the intended recipient and the sender essentially has the logs to deal with it. And that is the reason why it is now being used more and more by manufacturing industries, especially for the supply chain, because one, it creates transparency. You are able to know that from the A point, if a particular product is going, when it gets changed and it's entered into the system, the intended recipient is able to view, see those changes, and then it goes on to the next portion of it, and again, it gets modified. So these are the two main concepts that essentially exist as far as the NFT technology is concerned. Next slide, please. If we look at the NFT technology, how it essentially works is that there is a second generation blockchain that was introduced in 2014 that allow the developers to basically create these NFTs on it through a smart contract on a distributed ledger. So the main thing you have to understand with the smart contracts is that the developers and the businesses create the financial applications that use these cryptocurrencies or these tokens in order to create the whole business or the e-commerce within the system. And the main thing that is here is that these assets that are created or these tokens that are essentially rendered, they are what you call secured by its very system. There is no governance as far as this is concerned from it, but it is essentially done through these peer-to-peer networks. Next slide, please. So understanding the whole technology essentially means that NFTs that are being provided using these two systems of blockchain or cryptocurrency are basically non-fungible token assets which cannot be substituted. It is what you call an underlying asset is in that particular token. It is brought out through a concept or a process called minting. And it is generated according to that set of blockchain that is created. So you have programs such as Mintbox and Engine that allow these users to essentially mint. Next slide, please. So if we look at the whole concept of non-fungible token, it is something unique. It cannot be replaced. So you look at Bitcoin, does that make it non-fungible? No. A Bitcoin is essentially a fungible coin because you can trade that same coin with another. But an NFT is one of the type. You can use that, you can trade it, but that same coin or that same token will not be given to you. You either receive a value for it or you get a different thing absolutely that is, which is another NFT token, or you get a Bitcoin. So the main difference that you have to understand with respect to it is, one, it is like any of these collectible cards that you have right now. But the difference being that it is unique, it is only one of its kind. And that's what creates the difference between this and fungible tokens. Next slide, please. So if you just see what essentially an NFT does, this I think was the most common example I could take in order to show it to you. You have these physical cards that have a certain value and there's a trading value to it. It has what you call a value to it where people are even willing to pay for it or they give something else in exchange. Something similar exists as far as NFT is concerned. The only thing is the security feature that is here is very, very advanced because there's a unique data attached to every digital asset that is created. You can sell, buy, trade these, but only online on that particular system that is created. And that system that is created essentially verifies the trade and again creates a unique data and puts a stamp on it. That is one of the key things as far as NFT is concerned. So let's look at the key difference between fungible and non-fungible tokens. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So like I said, when you look at the physical object, which is like a collectible card, the main difference that exists is the uniqueness that is there as far as an NFT is concerned, as well as the fact that it's always online, that the whole system essentially exists. Next slide, please. So the difference between the fungible and non-fungible tokens is the fact that fungible tokens that can be exchanged and they have a value attached to it, and you give back give token, you get back a fungible token. But with a non-fungible token, it is a unique asset that is created and cannot be substituted. So therefore, when you give that non-fungible token out, you can get a value to it, or you can get another non-fungible token, which is completely different from that fungible token. Can we have the next slide, please? So if we look at the whole landscape that is out there, what is interesting is the fact that the whole system of non-fungible tokens has created a lot of what you call interest because of the value that is attached to every NFT exchange that comes. Right now, the sales volume of NFTs the world over is about 2.5 billion. That was in 2021. It has gone drastically up further. And right now, if you look at some of the things that have essentially been exchanged, I mean, it's phenomenal, the kind of value that is being attached. An artwork that was sold by people. So people essentially sold was a digital art form. And that was called the first 5,000 days. That sold for nearly 69.3 million. That is the most expensive NFT till date. You had a song that was created and became an NFT song. That's 1.33 million. A dog's meme sold for nearly 4 million, which is again the most NFT, expensive NFT meme. There was a virtual land sold for nearly 9 million. There was a crypto, and I think apart from this, there was Dorsey's Twitter, his first tweet that he put out there, which was nearly sold for, I think, 2.5 million or something like that. It's crazy the amounts that are essentially attached to each one of these, NFTs that are being exchanged. And what becomes more interesting is, next slide, please, is the value that is attached to each one of these. Prashant, you can keep going to the next slide. I'm just putting out there, the kind of data that is being created because of NFT, the kind of value that is being created, the kind of wealth that NFT is created, all for something which is a metadata, all for something that is not physical in nature, all for something that essentially ownership is still not legitimized upon the world over. What makes it or has created so much of importance as far as this NFT or the hype around NFT is concerned is mainly because of the value that everybody is putting each time an exchange happens. And the fact that they are saying that since there's no governance, that value is essentially being ascribed to the individuals. Therefore, it will hold good. But that might not be so, as the legal landscape might keep changing country to country. Like if you see in India, the very fact that the recognition of cryptocurrency is not there among our laws, but now cryptocurrency becomes taxable. So there is now a dichotomy there. There is no recognition to that kind of a currency, but automatically when you create taxability, then you essentially also saying that, look, I'm ascribing legitimacy to it. So this is an evolving law that essentially is being brought forth. And as far as the NFTs landscape is concerned, it has changed over the years. For the first time, when this whole thing concept came up, it was long before even Ethereum existed. It was in 2012 when there was something as colored coins, which was on a Bitcoin block exchange. These were used to prove some real world assets, and they become a mark of ownership as far as they were concerned. Then in 2014, Kevin McCoy came up with a quantum called NFT, which was the first known NFT. It was a pixelated octagon filled with different shapes that pulse in a quiet hypnotic way. And in 2014 and 16 is when this essentially came forth, and you had a Bitcoin blockchain that came forth. And counterparty platform allowed the creation of digital assets, and spells of Genesis followed this counterparty and started all kinds of issuance of NFTs for games. And one of the most prominent usage of NFT now has become for gaming assets as far as this is concerned. Next slide. So if you look at it, as the evolution of NFT happened, in 2021 now, you are seeing the token standards coming up. You have what is known as CryptoPunks, CryptoKitties, which have just taken the fascination of everybody to essentially utilize. In fact, CryptoKitties was one of the most popular formats of cute cats that had come up, where people started paying astronomical values to adopt, breed, and trade these cats. And from then on, now you are seeing in our present era, there are blockchains such as Cardano, Solana, Tezos, Flow, which start getting into the game of their own version of NFTs. Now, everybody, so you're seeing stars making NFTs. You're seeing like NBA has got into NFT. You're seeing sports players getting into NFT. So the entire now system of trading is now moving into NFTs as far as the whole landscape is concerned. So what is the future of NFTs? Next slide, please. Personally, since the law is still evolving, still there's a long way for the law to adapt as far as NFT is concerned. This will be driven so long as there is a demand and supply to it. So long there is a fascination, there is a hype with regard to what is being given out there, what is being created, and then the ownership of it, this whole trading of something not physical in nature essentially will come in. But now what we are going to essentially see is some of the key concepts will require to be eased out. You need to have a regulatory environment. Singapore, Japan are some of the countries that have emerged, but there's still a lot of changes that they require to do themselves. And we are far behind these, what you call more evolved regulatory landscape countries that are there. Legalization of cryptocurrency is another thing that requires to be looked into, as well as looking into how the IP rights in these digital assets essentially need to take place. Now I'm going to spend the next bit of my time essentially explaining what this relationship with IP rights are concerned. So today, I think you would have heard, the next slide please, Prashant. You would have essentially heard about NFT relationships. No, I think you need to go back to the previous one. Okay, yeah. No, just the next slide, future of NFTs and NFT issues. Yes. Thank you. So if you look at the NFT issues that are out there, I would like to also delve upon that the main aspect with respect to the NFT is this whole unit of data that is stored on the blockchain, that it can be sold and traded. The types of NFT data units, they're associated with different photos, videos, and audios. Okay, you create that token. That token is uniquely identifiable. These ledgers that are created on that blockchain claims ownership, and the legal rights are conveyed as far as that NFT is concerned because of the smart contract. But what essentially is being made is what we are going to talk about. Because NFTs are not restricting the sharing or copying of these underlying digital assets. They are not conveying also what are the IP rights that are being given when these NFTs are being transferred. So therefore, what we are seeing is it's a speculative asset, if I could say so. And one of the key things that is also there is there's a huge amount of data that is required, and therefore it is also creating a lot of carbon footprints in order to validate a blockchain transaction, which is a separate factor, but I just wanted to bring it to light. Also, like I said, because it brings into the question what this asset is about and where the ownership lies, it has essentially been compared to a Ponzi scheme. Next slide, please. So coming to this whole aspect of NFT ownership, one of the key things that we have to also keep in mind is that with NFT ownership, intellectual property is what I'd like to concentrate upon. Now, what is IP? You would have realized that it is basically something that you're trying to hold because of the creations that are there. With respect to NFT, anything essentially can turn into an NFT. So you're looking at artwork, literary work, your trademarks, your logos, music, all these essentially change itself and become NFTs. So where does the intellectual property right essentially lie. What is interesting is that each time a particular legitimate IP owner shares this to the person who is going to mint that token, is essentially increasing the chance of an IP infringement as far as is concerned. So nevertheless, NFTs do not automatically come with those IP rights. But what happens is when that ownership essentially is transferred, one has to see whether or not the IP rights have got transferred with it. Also, NFTs, because they are based in blockchain, they're decentralized. It does, of course, say that yes, these assets cannot be duplicated or replicated. But the fact remains, there is a possibility that somebody can make a copy of that digital asset also. When he does that, will he also get IP rights or ownership with respect to it? Another aspect that also needs to be kept in mind is that when NFTs was brought in, one of the key things that they tried to sell is that it will always protect originality and ownership because it can't get duplicated. But now we are seeing that every artwork that might have come out or a song that can come out, that can get duplicated with different copies that are out there. But what to keep in mind, the copy is a copy. The IP will always vest as far as the original is concerned and nowhere else. Next slide, please. So when we look at the relationship with IP rights, we are looking at three main aspects that are out there. What is the IP rights in NFT as far as copyright is concerned? What is the IP right as far as trademarks is concerned? And then, of course, you have your patents. What one has to keep in mind is when we look at the IP creations, we are trying to essentially regulate and protect the underlying rights that exist in that creation. And why is IP creations essentially supposed to get that protection? It is also a monopolistic right for that artist to basically create wealth as far as he's concerned because he exploits it. Not everybody can get it. Only those who would pay him essentially get a right. So the fundamental purpose of NFT is to manifestly prove the originality and the ownership, but also to secure the IP right is what one would say. But does that happen is what we need to also see. Next slide, please. The NFT ownership versus ownership of underlying, next slide, Prashant. The NFT ownership that is there, we have to see, but we also have to see the ownership of the underlying IP or assets within the NFT is concerned. So an NFT does not automatically come with the IP right. What happens is that the owners share their assets with the other person. That other person buys is an asset, but does he get the IP rights that are vested in it is something that we need to see. So what are the different rights that can exist? Next slide, Prashant. The main thing that we have to keep in mind as far as NFT is concerned is whether or not an ownership and copyright exists. So if we look at the next few things, we'll realize that when there is a purchaser of an NFT, what they get is ownership of the copy of that particular art that exists. And that comes in a cryptographically signed receipt. So the ownership with regard to copyright in that artwork or in that music or in that book or in a cover essentially will not automatically transfer to the person who buys that NFT. That one has to see whether or not it is there in the underlying contract. So there are contracts when they are essentially transferring these NFTs, which say that you can use or you have a license to use this particular, what you call token that has been created or the artwork that has been created, but only for the limited purpose of you displaying your ownership of the NFT or only for the limited purpose of trading. So they give those aspects, and the original copyright always rests with the creator. So let me give an example of, let's say, the tweet of John Dorsey. So when Dorsey did an NFT of his of his tweet, it sold for millions. But what that owner essentially got was only that token that determined the tweet of Dorsey, saying this is the first tweet that he made when he launched Twitter. But the IP in those words, which is that creative element that he had in those words that he sent out there, still remains with Dorsey. It still remains with the company that looks after these, tokens. It has not gone to the owner. The owner basically got that token in his hand. So that's one thing that one has to keep in mind as far as the IP rights in an NFT is concerned, is when you take an NFT, have you also taken any of the IP rights that exist in the original format of that particular artwork? Now, if we look at a digital asset that has been created, like a crypto kitty or a crypto, punk, that again, that's a unique card or asset that you get. The company will still retain its original rights on that artwork it has done, so it can trade in other formats as far as the rights are concerned. It might create another format of that particular kitty, but it will always retain its IP in that. What it gives you will only be a license to use, a right to use those figurines that are there on the token for you to trade, but that's about it. And that is an interesting phenomena as far as NFT is concerned, that it does not give any of these rights. Next slide, please. It's the same with respect to trademarks, that when you look at it, suppose, let's say there is an NBA team, or let's say Chennai Super Kings. Chennai Super Kings basically gives the right to a particular company to create tokens on their behalf. It is kind of like an advertisement for it. They will always retain ownership on their brand and logo. They are only giving that particular company the license to use. That company will create, let's say, Dhoni's face or any of these other players, their faces on those tokens, and those can be traded by the fans. Those can be used by the fans, but they will not say that they have the right over the logo or the brand of Chennai Super Kings or about how Dhoni looks, because what they are getting is only that token. That token is the extent of the ownership over their asset, which is that player's face. That's it. They do not get anything other than that. So therefore, if there is a person that starts minting this, so he gets that token, he starts making other copies to it, that becomes an infringement because he has done it without the real owner's permission. So the trademarks and these logos that might come in with these companies that are allowing for players or their tokens to come out for their fans to utilize, it is only a license to use. There is no other right that is being transferred greater than that. Now, coming to NFT as far as patents are concerned, next slide, please. With NFTs and patents, again, two concepts that exist here, as in the other IP rights. Any technology that you are creating, if it meets the requisites of the patent law, you're allowed to essentially patent that technology. Where the problem comes in is if that technology is purely a software. In India, you're not, or in some of the other countries also, you're not allowed to patent that software. If that software is dependent on anything adjunct or anything in addition, then you can essentially patent that technology. And it's the same thing as far as patents or NFT is concerned, is that any invention, let's say in crypto or blockchain, all this basically allows you to file for a patent, and it allows you to exploit it for that 20 plus 10 years, where you are allowed to give somebody else that technology to use, but again, only on a licensing purpose. There is an additional factor that is now coming in, which I will take in a bit, with regard to what you call intellectual property assets as non-fungible tokens. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So if you look at it, one of the key things, what have we understood? We have understood that there's IP rights in the underlying NFT that is created, which stays with the original owner. That does not get transferred. What gets transferred is the ownership of those tokens, but never the IP that is there. There is another concept that is essentially emerging, that because NFTs allows you to create ownership, it allows you to essentially also provide for ownership as well as tell transparency as far as this ownership is concerned. In the IP domain, innovators are being asked that you should aim to commercialize your inventions. So this is where they are trying to use NFT in to provide a conceptual framework where your IP asset basically is created as a non-fungible token, which means that if you have a copyright in a particular song, instead of filing it through the system, which will take you, let's say, 6 months to 8 months to get a registration, or if you are doing a registration of a trademark, it takes you what, nearly 18 months in India to get that done. It takes nearly 5 years unless you're using a fast track method. All these years and months can be rendered into negligibility if NFT for the IP asset is created, which means that that IP asset that you have, you turn it into a token, which gives you a timestamp as well as smart contract that says this belongs to you, and therefore you have the ownership. So you're tokenizing your IP. This is different from what we have spoken up till now. What we have talked about is the IP within the NFTs that are being created. Now I'm talking about using NFT in order to make your IP an asset. But for this, there is a framework that has to come in. One has to also look into aspects of how revenue will be generated from these tokens, as well as how licensing is supported once these tokens are rendered. All this is something that is evolving. There is a lot of document saying that your IP assets should be taken as NFT, so you cut down the red tapeism that is there where you are trying to register yourself. So you're looking at